Um, I've been working on piece-lead fish for about 3 years now, and so I'm gonna share with you guys a little bit of my research on microplastics, but more of my current research is on artificial light at night, and I've done a little bit over the last year on describing some new species in Ecuador. Um, but I hope you guys are interested in this, and but before we start with my research, I wanted to get into plastics generally and kind of pollution generally, just in case anyone. Yeah, I didn't know a lot of this stuff until I started doing research on it, basically. So okay, yeah. So human civilization has grown dramatically in developing and maintaining these civilizations. We've changed the environment by doing either one of two things, either extracting resources or producing waste. And these can all be boiled down to ways in which we change the environment. Otherwise, anthropogenic changes is typically the term that's used. This can include things like land use changes and urbanization or overharvesting of resources. Uh, Invasive species like domesticated cats can be spread in this way, um, and various forms of pollution, right? Pollution is of particular importance to us because of its immediate and like deadly effects on both the environment and humans. Uh, One novel pollutant that's kind of just starting to get a lot of scientific traction is plastic pollution. Uh, this can come in various forms. Uh, Most often, they start out as macroplastics, which are just large plastic debris. And this can spread out into oceans pretty readily because of their low density. Microplastics are often shed from these macroplastics, but can alternatively be produced by factories intentionally. Um, I can go a little bit more into the process of how plastic is made later on, but the idea is that most plastic companies or companies that work with any plastic utilities make these things called nurdles or these tiny plastic spheres that then they heat down or heat up and pressurize to form into the many types of plastics we see today. And some of these nurdles can still be found, especially near and around wastewater treatment plants, because uh, many factories, for example, one notable one in Port Aransas, uh, was recently fined several $1 million for offsetting hundreds of tons of these nurdles right here, and they end up on the beach and stuff. And based on the color, you really can't even tell that they're not not natural, right? Um, some plastics look like that. Others again look like shedding of macroplastics, so something like these plastic fibers down here. And others can be produced in the burning of waste and spread out to the air. One third form of plastic pollution that's often like fairly understated are leachates and co-pollutants. Oh, if you have any like immediate questions about any words I'm saying, please just like raise your hand or just ask me. Or like I guess there's a raise hand button in Zoom, so it'll let me know. But if it's not like directly affecting you in any way. Oh yeah, Troy, yes. Or was that maybe that was unintentional? Oh. Yeah. So, but otherwise, feel free to ask at the end as well. So yeah, leachates like bisphenol A, BPA, some of you might have heard of, and flame retardants like PTBEs or PBTEs, sorry, from like are often included in plastics as kind of just a part of them to help with either the flexibility or, in the case of flame retardants, just to make sure they don't set on fire very readily if you're planning to make an extension cord or something like that. Um, and these can have a lot of different effects as pollutants as well. I mean, uh, without even having to worry about most of the plastic components. So, uh, I've talked to you a little bit about the various like forms they can come in, but why is plastic of particular interest to us? And by us, I mean just globally. Uh, it's mostly because of one, its nascency. I mean, plastics didn't even exist 200 years ago, right? We were using natural elastomers and plastic alternatives, and its ubiquity. In this short period of time as a pollutant, it's blown up to massive proportions relative to other pollutants, right? In terms of the primary waste generated here, I have a figure from a very famous like 2017 science paper showing the amount of primary plastic waste generated in that year and the predictions for the future years if we continued growth uh, as business as usual is typically what the models are called. And I can say that in 2026 we have maintained these business as usual models. So plastic waste generation is about the previous estimates right now, which is several hundred thousands or tens of thousands of metric ton or million metric tons, right? Um, so just colossal amounts of plastic relative to pollutants like heavy metals, where you don't get too many at all, but they have really, really dramatic effects, right? Plastic is just coming in these massive waves. And at this point, there was a recent article put out by Science of the Total Environment, a very famous scientific journal, for their work on plastics, stating that they will no longer be accepting papers based on finding plastics in new areas uh, because of the fact that we have now found it at basically every possible, even the most remote locations. This is a image of microfibers found at the top of Mount Everest, which is, of course, the highest point on the Earth's surface, and this is a plastic bag found in the Mariana Trench. Um, One thing that's pretty interesting to me I didn't think about was how much plastic enters the ocean each year as opposed to is produced overall. I'm not sure how they actually get these measures, but the EPA states that it's roughly 12 million tons of plastic entering the ocean each year. But before we get into, I mean, anything more serious, like what is plastic, right? Uh, what is it made out of? How do we get it? Um, the most simple way I can explain it is that it's a plastic is anything that is a synthetic complex hydrocarbon. And this is more of a chemical description of what a plastic is, but there are also physical descriptors that can describe uh, things that naturally occur that are basically plastics in terms of their chemical properties. Um, by synthetic, I just mean that they are man-made. Complex is a word just used in organic chemistry just to mean that it can have these very long chains or these complex rings. They can have these very large chemical structures, so something like what we see down here. And they are hydrocarbons, meaning that they are primarily, if not entirely, made out of carbons and hydrogens. This down here is a monomer of polyethylene, so this is just one of the building blocks. And within them, here are some individual like smaller building blocks of what polyethylene might look like. And because of these rigid structures, they can be, I'll go into it a little more later, but they can be pretty resilient. So there are three major categories we can put plastics into, which are thermoplastics, thermosets, and elastomers. And thankfully, the names are pretty helpful for us. Thermosets are basically they set permanently when heated and pressurized. So something low density polyethylene or polystyrene, right? If you heated up polystyrene, which is like styrofoam, uh, you would not be able to bend it into a new structure. It comes out that way, and that's just the way it's going to be. It's going to crumble if you try to heat it up or burn. Thermoplastics are plastics that are still, they maintain some of their shape or they can be bent into new shapes when heated up. So PET and HDPE are two examples of those. PET, polyethylene terephthalate, is like the plastics in your water bottles. Or actually, it's also called polyester and is found in shirts. Like this one I'm wearing right now, it's like 99% polyester. Um, HDP is just an overall like very rigid plastic, but the idea is that these are kind of the plastics that are more frequently recycled or can be recycled because they can be heated and bent back into new shapes and new structures that can be recollected in this way. Whereas thermosets are not always as useful. Elastomers, which I don't have on this list, are not less common, but they make up things that are like rubber-like structures. So like tires are predominantly made of elastomers, and anything that kind of looks like rubber but isn't like natural rubber, that's some sort of elastomer. So these are like the material science definitions for plastics. But they're helpful for considering their potential biological effects going forward. And overall, they have a variety of shapes, structures, and sizes. I mean, these are just six of the hundreds of variations of plastics. But they're good enough categories for to help us explain them in the future. And the most important thing is that they all break down mechanically over time and become these much smaller microplastics and nanoplastics in the environment. So you probably hear a lot about microplastics in the news or whatnot, uh, but it's just a simple designation of a plastic particle that is less than 5 millimeters in diameter, which means that they can be anywhere ranging from, and this graph I've used is not necessarily, this comes from a figure in a paper that doesn't represent the whole field entirely. But we all can agree that it starts at 5 millimeters and it goes down to some say zero point 0.3 centimeters, some say 1 nanometer, and that's when they get into the nanoplastics range. Um, so there's a great deal of variation about size, but there's also a great deal of variation about shape. Uh, the ways different plastics break down can end up producing things like fragments or spheres or fibers, pellets, foams, sheets, films, etc. Again, these are all kind of just vague descriptors for the overall gestalt of the plastic. Um, but it is very helpful for us understanding, one, what are the distribution of these different shapes like, and how do they affect animals, or people for that matter, right? So spheres are fairly uncommon. Oh, yes, Troy. Oh, okay. I think your hand is up, but I'm not sure if. Oh, yeah. Is the plastics the same ones as used to make fishing plastics? Um, as in like the plastic lures or the
Probably
lures are.
the monofilament line. The
Yeah. Yeah, it absolutely is. So the plastics used in monofilaments is nylon or polyamide, PA. And that is a it's pretty common in the ocean, but overall fairly uncommon. It doesn't have too many other uses. Is it artificial? Like, sorry, I'm not sure if I understand the question.
yeah, it's yeah, they're synthetic, right? So it's all of these are synthetic.
Yes,
Yeah.
100% of the plastics are synthetic. Um, Now, if it is a soft plastic looking thing and it isn't synthetic, it could be a natural rubber. There could be natural like bioplastics they call them. But a lot of these bioplastics um, have so many similarities to actual plastics that they end up being kind of just as bad for the environment in some cases, or as bad for us. That's obviously not true of all of them, but they also require a great deal of effort to make. Um, so yeah, bioplastics are really interesting. Okay, I guess I'll X that out for now, but um, yeah. So yeah, there's a great deal of variation in shape, size, color, density. All of these predict how they end up moving around through the water, uh, how if they end up in sediment more frequently, um, and what they do to animals. And so overall spheres of beads are fairly uncommon because they would have to maintain that shape over a long time from like even in the face of weathering and whatnot. And not all plastics do that. Fibers are extremely common because they shed from your clothes or from any sort of cloth material. There is some amount of microplastics fibers being shed from that. Um, every time it's washed or anything like that. So those are really common. Foams, again, are less common. Fragments and fibers are really the ones that are very, very common just because of the ways that plastics break down. And because of those structures, it makes them particularly hard to get out of the digestive tract or from the lungs because they stick to things really easily. So how do they get into the environment in the first place, though? So we know that there are these microplastics, and there's a variety of them, um, and same kind of follows for how they transport and where they end up, or also known as their fate, basically. They call it microplastic fate, um, which a lot of them come from wastewater treatment plants and industrial wastewater, mostly because wastewater treatment plants really were not built with plastic removal intentionally in mind, and filtering out plastics is really difficult because of I don't think I mentioned it. Oh yeah, I put it here, but I didn't mention it. They're chemically inert. These chains, these big complex hydrocarbons are actually really, really hard to break down at a chemical level. They at a physical level they break down easily, but at a chemical level it doesn't really interact with much. So it's hard for us to filter them out in any very clear way where we're not catching a ton of other stuff at the same time. So wastewater treatment plants, unfortunately, it gets through the wastewater most of the time. Medical waste is a huge source of this. Sewage sludge kind of falls in the same way. There is plastic that we produce, of course, in landfills and such, and that we just, if we casually throw away something, or if something falls off our car and it ends up on the side of the road, it'll stay there. Um, yeah, and so all of that runs off from the surface into bodies of water. And even some of them are low density enough to evaporate with those bodies of water and end up in the atmosphere. Fibers tend to do this a lot. Do processes like RO and microfiltration help remove microplastics better? Yes, that's a great question. Uh, yeah, RO or like reverse osmosis does help remove the plastics a lot from the initial thing, as well as, of course, everything else basically. Microfiltration can help a lot, but again, with processes like RO and microfiltration, the other difficult thing is that most of the machines that are used for this inevitably have plastic parts that are interacting with the water in some way, and that eventually over time that does end up being plastics in the water again. Different kinds, but still plastics. Thank you. Okay, so we kind of know how they. Oh, right. I should go a little more into atmospheric deposition since this is fairly new. Um, but basically, a lot of these plastics are so low density that they can kind of float up and stick into water molecules and end up in the clouds. Uh, and then they can deposit all over the world this way or go back into other bodies of water. So this is a kind of a very underrepresented mode of transportation that we have very little information on, but uh, from some of the recent research being done, it ends up being kind of a shocking amount that's spread. Of course, mostly fibers and things that are very, very light. So, but yeah, the question then becomes, okay, we know the traits, we know how they get into the environment, but what do they actually do when they get there? How do they affect the environment or the animals living there? Uh, and so over the last roughly 20 years, if not a little less than that, researchers have looked into this. Plastic pollution famously produces suites of physiological or behavioral conditions across animal taxa. In birds, it's frequently described that there's a lot of lung and gut inflammation. Very few studies actually experimentally expose birds, but many of them collect birds that are like near cities or nearby and identify their gut contents and whatnot. In a very interesting case in hermit crabs, it was discovered that microplastic exposure actually alters their ability to select shells. I'm not sure how many of you know this, but hermit crabs select shells when it comes time for them to outgrow their previous shell. And so, one important decision they make is in picking the right kind of structure for a shell and picking a large enough shell. And so, they found that under exposure, basically, plastics in the water column induced some level of brain damage and decrease their ability to uh, make correct decisions about shell selection. In this is a Xenopus frog larvae, uh, and it's been exposed to BPA, as I mentioned before, bisphenol A. And it has a endocrine disrupting effect on these organisms and many others, including humans, actually. Uh, but in this case, BPA upon under like during development induced feminization in these Xenopus tadpoles, which obviously has loads of implications for its life as an adult and its fitness. And in many, many studies of rats, we've found that uh, microplastics induce oxidative stress and cancer. Oxidative stress is a very common overall response to any waste product in your body. It's not necessarily like specific to plastics or pollutants in any way, but if your body is even holding a lot of cortisol, a lot of stress, it will produce this oxidative stress trying to consume all of these unwanted molecules in the body, and it just burns a lot of energy. Cancer is more recent work, but some of the studies of air pollution have tied it to lung cancer. Others have tied it to esophageal cancer. So we know that these effects span pretty broadly across taxa and across different um, traits. But one common thread I want to focus on here is the way it interacts with animals through their behavior or the behavioral results of these. Because animals are the only living beings that really can produce behavior. So the way pollutants interact with animals is uniquely through their behavior, right? It's effectively a dimension through which only they can be affected and present these illnesses. Um, that other groups have little to no access to. And this has made animal behavior of particular interest to researchers in both behavioral ecology and ecotoxicology. So I've told you some of the points about the prevalence of microplastics in the environment and some of the effects they've had across groups. But I haven't told you about three major gaps in the literature. Especially when I was first starting my research, this was kind of what I was looking at. I was like, hang on, there's some problems we can identify in the field. One is that there was a lack of environmentally relevant microplastics being used in exposure studies. Among MP exposure studies, they didn't use the correct sizes or shapes or things that very well mimicked the environments that the organisms were actually living in. And they didn't use these because there was a kind of overall mismatch between the environmental data. There was very poor data on microplastics at the time. And the techniques for creating microplastics in a very consistent way were um, not well developed. Another thing is that studies have primarily ignored behavior and cognition and favored looking at physiology. So things like overall body condition, oxidative stress was one thing I mentioned, things like diseases and cancer. Um, and this ignores traits of pretty substantial significance both to humans and to organisms living in these environments because it has a lot of implications for their fitness and overall for health of any organism. And finally, this is one that's more particular to my research, is that they rarely addressed sex differences. They would often treat all individuals exposed, whether they were male or female, as basically the same. But we know that from a great deal of research, the sexes can differ in their physiological sensitivities or uh, their physiology and behavior effectively, which can confound these treatment effects, right? In some cases, for example, in my organism, the females are much larger than the males, which typically makes them more resilient. They have a larger liver, which also is a pretty good indicator of how healthy they can seem under stressed conditions. Um, so if you don't account for this, how are you going to figure out when one particular sex is being affected or the other, and how that affects the overall population? Uh, so yeah, these were three gaps I was trying to target in my research. And overall, I wanted to ask the question, knowing all of this, well, what are the effects of environmentally relevant microplastics on behavior and cognition in fish? So to answer these questions, I used the model organism Gambusia affinis, the western mosquitofish. It is native to Texas and widely abundant. It is globally invasive. Initially, it was brought around the globe because it was thought that uh, because of its name, it ate mosquitoes and did really well at eating mosquito larvae. It didn't actually do that well, but they are really resilient. They've been really polluted habitats. Um, and another thing is because I wanted to use them because of their large differences between males and females. This is that sex-specific variation or differences I was talking about. And two other reasons. One, they're very small and easy to maintain. And then three, they're really, really smart for their size. And what I mean by that is that you can put them in these assays and these little tasks, and they'll solve things. I'm gonna show you guys an example of this, but this is it's a whole, yeah. This is one of my students running this fish right here through a maze in which there are two correct door choices, and there is a friend at the end of this assay that she wants to get to. So she's done this trial before about four times now, so she knows the drill. She goes through that first door, no problem. Sees her friend on the other side, tries to get around, sees that there's nothing working over here, leaves, come back. comes back around, uses that information to try the new door. It's pretty hard to see her at this point, but I'll just point her out, right? And then boom. And she's solved the task. She is entered through the maze and made it out. This is what we call spatial learning. So yeah, uh, that was the organism I'm going to use. And within that larger question of how does it affect cognitive behavioral traits, I'm asking these smaller questions of one, does it produce cognitive decline specifically in spatial learning and inhibitory control? Uh, and two, does it affect behaviors directly associated with fitness like reproduction and feeding? Um, we have some evidence from other studies, for example, in zebrafish and marine jacobfurs and bumblebees and some other stuff, we find that MPs typically induce decline in both spatial learning and inhibitory control. And we find that MPs reduce male mating rates and reduce feeding overall. So this was my experiment. First, I created some microplastics. Specifically, I worked with 42 micron length PET microfibers. This is what I found was most environmentally relevant based on a literature search and some work with lab at the University of Rhode Island. I next measured the prior exposure individuals had to plastics and determined what plastics I should make. That also predicted what I would make here. And then I split the fish up into groups of six each week, three males and three females, placed one in, or placed them in one of these three treatments, control, low, and high, for 14 days. And then after 14 days of exposure, these individuals were tested in five tasks over 2 days. On the first day, individuals were tested in the feeding task, the inhibitory control task, and scototaxis, which is a task I won't be discussing with you guys because it's not particularly interesting. Um, and on day two, the males alone were tested in mating, and the all individuals were tested in the root learning test for spatial learning. Afterwards, I collected all of the organs and dissected individuals, and I ran this for about 8 months and collected 170-ish fish. And let's move on to the results. So first thing, our first confirmation that we're doing well is we found microplastics in the gills, guts, the gonads, and the brain. We found that they cross the blood-brain barrier, which was something we predicted about microplastics of this size. These are really, really small, so you couldn't see them with your eyes, but under a microscope, I stained them bright red so that they could appear like this, only under fluorescent light, but we found them in basically every organ. But overall, we found that there were very, very few microplastics in each individual fish. So roughly 2.5 plastics per fish were identified of the ones that I exposed them to. Of course, I've only exposed them for 2 weeks, so over a lifetime, perhaps this changes. So I mentioned I was measuring inhibitory control. So to measure this, we used a assay that we use pretty frequently in my lab, which is the detour reaching assay. Basically, an individual is put here, and there's a glass barrier separating them from a conspecific social reward. Conspecific, just a friend, basically. Um, and we test their inhibitory control or their ability to suppress their impulses and get around this glass barrier. It's a pretty wide barrier, so they know they can't just go straight forward. They have to figure out another way to get around this. And they have to get around to this area where they can't see their friend and then move back over. So that's what we're testing here. This is a pretty common inhibitory control is a pretty common ability found in basically every animal alive. Um, we found one major thing was that microplastic exposure induced sex-specific and non-monotonic declines. Non-monotonic meaning that it doesn't just go up with the concentration, right? So more plastics does not mean more damage in this case. And we found that there were sex differences in the initial group. So this is just confirming that we know what we said before, that there are sex differences between the males and the females. Females tend to perform pretty bad in this assay, whereas the males are pretty good at solving this really quickly. And we can see this here in solve latency. The amount of time it took them to solve this, about 600 seconds, meaning that many females didn't solve. Most males solve pretty rapidly. And this is going into the decreased inhibitory control I mentioned before, under and specifically the pattern we found. One, we found that females actually did not change in their overall uh, performance under exposure or away from exposure. But males exhibited this non-monotonic response, uh, being that at the control groups, they did great and solved the assay no problem. Under low concentrations, which is 10 plastics per liter, uh, males did very poorly in this assay and did comparable, if not as bad, if not worse than females on average. And then under very high exposure, we find that males actually perform well again. So this is a really puzzling result, but it has a lot of potential fitness consequences. Uh, One, inhibitory control is really important for making decisions about predators or mating efforts. And so, if this affects their inhibitory control in some way, this may have implications on selection for male, as if they can't find mates well enough, this lends towards females having an advantage under sexual selection, which is something that's a little complicated, but I can go into more later. Um, Another thing is that, well, what's the deal with the non-monotonic response? Why isn't it that we find that greater concentrations have greater effects? Uh, and one potential mechanism for this is through endocrine disruption, as we mentioned before, or through neurotoxicity. Oxidative stress can happen anywhere in the body and even in the brain. And when it happens in the brain, it's called neurotoxicity. So neurotoxic interactions in the brain could affect the position in the brain the where inhibitory control kind of lives, uh, potentially altering it there at low concentrations. And endocrine disruption is one of those things that uh, very frequently exhibits this non-monotonic response, where if you expose your body to a ton of estrogen or a ton of testosterone, the effects are not as pronounced as if you would expose it to a very slight amount in nature. And that would be another form of endocrine disruption. So in spatial learning, to measure spatial learning, we use the root learning task where they can, either get in these incorrect doors or go through the correct ones. Briefly, we went over 5 trials and we considered, or yeah, I should mention spatial learning is the ability to recall and navigate spaces. Um, and we looked at the overall proportion of correct to incorrect door choices and whether that decreased or increased over time. So we found that under any level of exposure, females were unable to spatially learn. Uh, but we found that the control female groups were able to spatially learn sufficiently, meaning that they exhibited a significant decrease in the amount of errors they made over time. So they actually improved in this assay, whereas basically no other group did, including the control males, meaning that males on average are just bad at this task. And so they can't really be used in this case. But under exposure, females do just as bad as them under both low and high. Again, could have some fitness consequences as females with impaired spatial learning may struggle to learn forage where foraging patches are or learn to quickly navigate from away from predators. This may additionally impact their ability to exude female choice, as females often have to flee males because of their very frequent mating attempts at them in the wild, and that's not always to their advantage. Uh, Another thing is that these are potentially predictive of uh, physiological mechanisms. Again, this sex-specific response suggests that this might be an endocrine disruption thing where it's altering some sort of sex hormone or maybe a hormone that's associated with maternal care, like luteinizing hormone or follicularizing hormone, or that it may be neurotoxic in some way, though there's more evidence for endocrine disruption. Uh, in feeding, the results on this are a little simpler. So to measure feeding, we placed food at the top of the water column after feeding them on a consistent schedule for 2 weeks at 9 a.m. And we tracked the food responsiveness of the individual. Basically, how quickly do they respond to that food? How quickly do they go up to eat? Um, and we also measured another thing where, so again, I said these fish are pretty smart under low oxygen conditions or under highly stressful conditions. They can do this thing where they skim at the top of the water column and place their like mouth right near the top of the water column and take in these big gulps of like heavily air infused water to help relax them and get them a ton of oxygen, which allows them to like swim and live in like very, very shallow, very low oxygen environments. We found that plastics altered their water column use by increasing the amount of skimming they did and increased their food responsiveness, irrespective of sex, of course. So that's shown right here with latency to feed being pretty high in the control group and very low in the low and high groups. Again, latency to feed is how much time it took them to start eating. So these guys started eating really, really rapidly, which is actually the opposite of what we've expected based on past literature. Most literature found that this decreased their food responsiveness, potentially because of their perceived satiety. Maybe they ate so many plastics that they think they're full or something like that. But our results suggest that the plastics might exhaust them in a way that increases their metabolism and thus increases their overall hunger. Uh, Again, I mentioned skimming is typically a response to, um, I don't know if you guys can see that there, to hypoxic conditions. So, because most of the plastics we found ended up in the gills because we exposed them via waterborne exposure, uh, we think that plastics in the gills may make getting enough oxygen very difficult for these fish. So they have to spend more time skimming and taking these gulps at the top of the water column. Uh, these are potentially adaptive responses to MP exposure, meaning that they are intentional changes that are not necessarily intentional, but uh, changes the organism makes to adjust to a physiological deficit that we are seeing, um, rather than something that just happens to them, like a negative effect. But this can have all sorts of costs and potentially trade-offs associated with it. So to go back over our questions, one, does it affect cognition? Does it affect your brain? Yes, and not yours, but the fish. Yes, we do find that there is support for the prediction that microplastics affect spatial learning and cognitive flexibility, though we find this in a sex-specific and, again, dose-dependent or non-monotonic manner. And for whether or not they affect feeding, we find support for the opposite prediction. I did not include reproduction here because I am still actually working on this data a little bit, but I would be, yeah, I don't want to speak to it too soon. But so far, it doesn't look like there is that much going on with reproduction, but we'll have to see. So yeah, thank you all for listening to this brief talk. And of course, this wouldn't be possible at all without the undergrads I worked with that helped so much with this process and running the fish and helping me catch them and everything. This is Jing, Adrian, and Rivers. And they presented this at the Texas Plastic Pollution Symposium last year, which is an incredible symposium that if any of you are interested in water quality, I highly recommend going to. It's completely free. It takes place either somewhere I mean, somewhere in Texas, usually Corpus Christi or Houston, and is a really great way for students to get involved with research at any level. I mean, I've seen even middle school students can give presentations there, and it can be really incredible.
All right. Well, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm going to pause here and see if anybody has any questions. Let's see, is Olivia has a question. In the future, would you want to, whoops, let me go to chat box.
Oh, sorry. In the future, would you want
Yeah.
to repeat the experiment using a different organism? Um, to be maybe, maybe. The thing is, if I were to repeat the experiment, I would probably want to use a different concentration depending on what that organism tends to experience in their environment. So if I worked with shrimp, for example, I'd want to use sediment concentrations of plastics, which are very different and much, much higher than the water concentrations. Um, if I wanted to work with something more closely related to humans, I probably wouldn't. I would leave that to somebody that works with rodents or somebody that works with primates. I'm more of a fish guy, but yeah. And yeah, but to your point, I think this experiment should absolutely be repeated by someone, by many people, because the results I find are kind of jarring and not typical overall. And so I'd love it if more people could do this in other organisms to see if maybe it's just a thing that happens in my organism or if it's a thing that actually is pretty widespread. Ocean gave a question, given your finding of an average of 2.5 microplastic pieces per fish, how might fish size influence microplastic accumulation? Would you expect larger species to show higher levels of contamination? This is a incredible question, and there are many there's a really great study on this looking at trophic transfer of microplastics. Yes, I mean, short answer is yes, larger species do have higher levels of contamination. This is partially because they have more room to hold more plastic, and also because plastics tend to bioaccumulate. Not always, but they can bioaccumulate because again, they are very resilient. They can last a long time. So if they get stuck in a part of the body and don't leave, then whatever animal is eating that animal gets all of the plastics and inherits all of the plastics that that prey animal just ate. So you'll find in organisms like whales, they have tons of plastics in them. And birds, especially seabirds, get a ton of plastics in them as well because they're effectively at the top of their food chain. And so even though they're not physically that large, because they um, are at the top of their food chain, they eat a ton of plastics. I hope that answers the question. Uh, Do you think that fish could adapt to higher levels of microplastics in the water, in small concentrations? Do you think they could eventually thrive? Uh, that's again really great question. Um, Plastics are one of those really interesting things because it is very novel in some ways, but it's also actually not so novel in other ways. I mentioned they're synthetic complex hydrocarbons. But if you remove the synthetic part, if it's made by anything, um, complex hydrocarbons are really, really common in nature. And one of the most common ones is cellulose. It's a big complex hydrocarbon that we chew and we call it fiber, and we eat it in our diets very readily. And so plenty of organisms are designed to eat these things. So some plastics, maybe, no problem. Um, Maybe not necessarily my fish, and I don't think that plastic concentrations at this point are high enough for them to seriously evolve adaptations for it. But there are many studies looking at the gut microbiome and looking at the how the gut microbiome responds to plastics and whether or not certain organisms have the ability to digest plastics. And they find that actually there's a great researcher here at UT, Kasia Dinklu, who her lab is all about this. Uh, it's called bioprospecting, or the idea of looking out into nature to find solutions for man-made problems. And they find that there's this soldier fly and the larvae of the soldier fly, because it has the gut microbiome to chew on and eat up all sorts of complex hydrocarbons like tree bark. They were like, okay, well, could it eat a plastic? And they find that it actually can eat and digest plastics and get nutrients out of it,
Hmm.
uh, especially polystyrene. So they are working to isolate the bacteria within the guts of those organisms and see if they can grow a very common bacteria that we can throw out onto plastics and have it digested, break it down.
Are you familiar with any of the techniques or doing any work with wastewater treatment systems where they're trying to figure out ways to remove them before it's released?
I am not actually, I'm not.
Yeah. She has a question. Do you think the possibility of adaptation is higher in a species that reproduces at a faster rate than, say, mammals?
100%. Yeah, that's a great question and very true. Adaptation tends to be much higher in species that reproduce at a faster rate because their generation time allows for the way I see it, it's kind of like the environment is giving a call and the organism is giving a response. The species is giving a response. And how quickly you can respond to that depends on your generation time. What can the next generation produce? And how many mutations are there? And it tends to be that species that reproduce at a faster rate also tend to have larger population sizes. And uh, a kind of good rule of thumb is that the larger a population size is, the better they are at adapting to things in their environment because they are under greater selective pressure. There's a whole ton of math behind that, but the idea is just that organisms in really, really large populations don't have to deal with random chances towards things, and they have so many opportunities to get a successful mutation that even a very slightly beneficial mutation will put them at an advantage over tens of thousands of peers.
All right, this is some great questions. We'll have one more call for questions before we wrap it up. Well, it's nearly kept him an hour. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
Well, all right. Well, thanks again. Appreciate you being with us today. I did record it. And I record it to send the link to those that weren't able to be here live. So it's not publicly sent out or anything like that. But if you'd like, I could send you a link as well to this
Yes,
presentation so
that'd
that
be
you
really
have it.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you all as well. These were really great questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess I will let you go. I'm going to stick on with them in just a few more minutes, but um, I will be in touch.
Okay. Thank you all.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
All righty.